Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. The FCC has come out with a document where they are seeking comment on what would be considered broadband, from speeds to other aspects that they might want to take into account. And they are looking for comments from you, from me, and from others. Be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Usey here with Zecorum with Broadband Deployment News. So I want to take a look at this. This just came out. This is, you see here, broadband speed benchmark. FCC launches inquiry to increase minimum broadband speed benchmark and to set a gigabit future goal. So they've kind of hinted at this, and they actually put this out prior as kind of a test balloon maybe, but this is where they're officially seeking comment. And they're doing this kind of in conjunction with their kind of annual State of the Broadband report that they do. So they are required to do that as part of the Telecommunications Act, and they're taking this time now to seek comment on this. So I wanted to dig into this a little bit and see exactly what their ideas are. And again, this is for them to be seeking comment from all stakeholders. That's people in the industry, consumers, anybody really can put in a comment if you'd like to. So we'll take a look at that. And you can see I've linked to this page as well as to the Telecommunications Act if you wanted to do some really heavy lifting and reading on that. But I do reference one part of the Act just to show where they're required to do this. So I'll show that in a minute. But that's all linked in the description of this video. So you see here, we've got two documents. There's the news release I won't bother looking at. It's pretty short. And then there's the notice of inquiry, which we're going to take a look at here. So the news release mentions just a few summary things, and then we'll dig in here to this notice of inquiry. So that's what this is. So you see here, 17th Section 706 report, notice of inquiry, and adopted October 25th. It was released November 1st. So this was just a couple of days ago. Comment date. So you can make comments up to December 1st, 2023, and their reply comment dates will be December 18th when they reply to the comments that they've received. So you can see here the table of contents, everything that they are asking in here, but I'm going to go through some sections. It's a long document. I'm certainly not going to read this document, but I've got some sections highlighted that I wanted to highlight, so to speak. So here you see just quick summary kind of in the beginning. We propose in this notice to take a long overdue fresh look at our standards for evaluating broadband deployment and availability. So it's been set at, I think, 25 by 3 now for years, many years. And, you know, we've kind of known that that's not fast enough, but see, the problem is if you update the definition of broadband, then you'll have people that before you update the definition that have broadband, and then suddenly you change the definition, and suddenly you thought you were making progress, and suddenly like, wow, we're not making any progress. We have fewer people that have broadband today than we did years ago because you're moving the goalposts, right? And some of that was due to necessity and technology. So we didn't have ubiquitous fiber back years ago. So 25 by 3 seemed pretty reasonable. In fact, 10 by 1, it wasn't too long prior to that, it was 10 by 1. And so there's reasons for that, for this kind of, I think, holding off, especially as we were trying to determine who has broadband, who doesn't. So again, if you suddenly raise the bar, then, you know, fewer and fewer people have broadband as you do that. So I think it makes sense, especially as I mentioned yesterday, when we were talking about something different, the fact that you're going to set a goal of, let's say, 100 by 20 is reasonable, because if you're going to hit that, and again, with the availability of fiber now and prices having come down, you know, they've gone back up again since inflation and some supply chain things, but it really, compared to years ago, it's come down, and a lot of operators are looking at fiber. If you can do fiber at all, that's really what a service provider is going to want to do, okay? That's because they know if they put in fiber, then that's really future-proof technology, not just for the consumer, but for them. So they can easily get, if they're going to put in fiber, 100 by 20 is nothing. They can easily do that. They can do 100 by 100. They can go to a gig. With technology available today, they can do 10 gig and even 25 gig, all in the same chassis, all in the same OLT. So, you know, I think we're at a point now where we can say if you can do 100 by 20, that's a good goal to hit. And it also does not lock out those really high cost areas where maybe fiber is not a good option today. So that's what they're kind of trying to balance here as they look at this. We also propose to make this inquiry our first to use the new broadband data collection, or BDC data. The Commission's prior broadband data reports have for many years relied primarily on the FCC Form 477 deployment data to evaluate consumers' broadband options for fixed and mobile services. So that problem is fixed. The maps may not be as accurate as everyone likes, but they're really pretty darn accurate, and they are way better than what we had when we were looking at the FCC Form 477 data. And that's where the data was reported by ISPs just in a census block. So they just had to say, yeah, we serve the census block. So that could be 30, 40 homes or more. I forget how many people might be in a census block. So you could have an ISP coming and saying, yeah, we serve the census block, and maybe they only serve half of it, or maybe they only serve a few homes in that census block. But if they did serve a few homes in that census block, that whole census block was considered to be served. And obviously that is not good for trying to figure out who has broadband and who doesn't. So the broadband data collection, the Broadband Data Act and the broadband data collection process was meant to resolve that, where now we are down to an address by address location, and basically broadband serviceable locations. Every single structure in the U.S. that should have broadband is supposed to be on that map, with the exception, I think, of community anchor institutions, which for some odd reason they decided we're getting broadband from somewhere else, when most of them probably do get broadband from the local provider. So that includes apartment buildings and how many units they're supposed to have. And, it doesn't necessarily include, I think, that whether every unit has broadband, but it's much better than it was when we were saying, okay, well, this census block has broadband, when we had no idea how many locations with that census block actually have it. So they're going to be using this new broadband data that has been collected now for the last year or so. In response to this notice, we seek objective data and other evidence to evaluate the universal service goals for broadband. We encourage individual consumers, providers of broadband services, consumer advocates, analysts, policy institutes, governmental entities, and all other interested parties to help us determine the most effective ways to complete this statutory mandated task. And let's see here, statutory standard for the Section 706 inquiry. Section 706 requires us to annually conduct an inquiry concerning the availability of advanced telecommunications capability to all Americans. Notably, for the first time since enacting Section 706, Congress in the Infrastructure Act, that would be the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So in that act, they provided additional statutory text regarding the meaning of the provision. Specifically, Congress describes Section 706 as setting out the statutorily mandated goals of universal service for advanced telecommunications capability. We therefore believe the Infrastructure Act supports the view that the Commission must determine whether advanced telecommunications capability is available universally throughout the country, or, in the words of the statute, to all Americans. We seek comment on this analysis, how we should apply it in the context of the statutory language that we must assess whether such capability is being deployed to all Americans in a reasonable and timely manner. To what extent should the Commission evaluate the progress and pace of recent broadband deployment? So those are some of the questions to start out. And I wanted to share real quickly what that is in the this is the 1996 kind of amendments to the Telecommunications Act, or additions. So see here it's 706. This is on page 1010, and you're going to link to this entire thing if you wanted to look at it. The page numbers are up in the right corner, and it's terrible to read, and I didn't read the whole thing, but I did find the section. So see here, Section 706, advanced telecommunications incentives, and this is under Title 7 of the Act, not Title 2. I believe it's Title 2, right? That they're trying to do with net neutrality. So this is under Title 7. In general, the Commission and each state commission with regulatory jurisdiction over telecommunications service shall encourage the deployment of a reasonable and timely basis of advanced telecommunications capability to all Americans in a manner, and it mentions a couple of times in here elementary schools and classrooms, so they specifically say that, in a manner consistent with the public interest, convenience, and necessity, price cap regulation, regulatory forbearance, measures that promote competition in the local telecommunications market, or other regulating methods that remove barriers to infrastructure investment. So it's interesting here, they mention two things. One is price cap regulation. And this is something that all broadband providers are concerned about. And that would be that they would be treated as a utility where the government could come in and say, you need to set your top price or your max price at X or Y, whatever. So in other words, it'd be the government dictating what a private operator or company can do. So that's one concern of broadband operators under Title II that the FCC could do this. But here, like I say, this is under Title VII, and specifically saying that would be something that the FCC could do. Now, this is something where, again, you'd have to kind of think of a broadband operator. If you've got several broadband operators in the territory that are competing, are they utilities or are they private companies that are providing a service? So there's that price cap regulation. But then you've got regulatory forbearance. So net neutrality rules would be adding additional regulatory burdens upon companies. So here they're saying you can take off regulations if it means that we'll be able to deploy broadband more widely and have it available to more people, maybe at a lower price, so that you don't have regulations pushing the price up. So it's very interesting because that would be kind of counter to the net neutrality argument, where you could look at regulatory forbearance. Measures that promote competition in the local telecommunications market. So, that would be, you certainly want to make sure that things are not anti-competitive. I'm not sure what might promote competition, but of course, with the Infrastructure Act, one of the things that they are trying to, that they would like to have happen, would be other kinds of providers to get in the market, and that would be electric membership co-ops, so EMCs, rural electric utilities. You've got municipalities. They'd like smaller operators to get involved. So again, those are all reasons to have less regulation, certainly of smaller operators. So those are the kinds of things that can help with competition. They're looking at maybe open access networks where you've got public-private partnership where somebody builds the network. Let's say it could be the municipality builds the network, and then you've got somebody coming in to run it with multiple ISPs, or vice versa. Private company comes in and builds a network, and the municipality kind of foots the bill, but they run it and let other ISPs in there. So that's one way to do it. So again, looking at ways to promote competition or other regulating methods that remove barriers to infrastructure investment. So again, some would say net neutrality is a barrier. It's a regulation that could be a barrier to internet or infrastructure investment. But there's other things, regulatory things like pole attachments, those kinds of things, permitting, that really need to be looked at and is being looked at, because these are things that are burdens right now, especially if you want to get this stuff done quickly. You have to get some of these kind of red tape things either gone or shortened so that you can get, for example, access to poles. And then who is it that's going to pay for poles that need to be replaced? Is it does the company requesting access to that pole, if that's going to cause, if you've got to do make-ready work, or if it's going to cause the pole to be replaced, then who's going to bear that burden? I mean, does it need to be replaced anyway? And it's just an excuse because somebody's coming in there and wants to attach something. So there's those kinds of questions as well that need to be looked at. The Commission shall, within 30 months after the date of enactment of this Act, and again, this was 1996, so, and regularly thereafter, I don't know if it says it every year, but I think they do it every year, try to anyway, initiate a notice of inquiry concerning the availability of advanced telecommunications capability to all Americans. In the inquiry, the Commission shall determine whether advanced telecommunications capability is being deployed to all Americans in a reasonable and timely fashion. If the Commission's determination is negative, it shall take immediate action to accelerate deployment of such capability by removing barriers to infrastructure investment and by promoting competition in the telecommunications market. And then it defines here advanced telecommunications capability. And this was really before the term broadband was widely used, so they were calling it advanced telecommunications capability. The term advanced telecommunications capability is defined without regard to any transmission media or technology as high-speed switched, broadband telecommunications capability that enables users to originate and receive high-quality voice, data, graphics, and video telecommunications using any technology. So in other words, it doesn't matter if it's fixed wireless, fiber, cable, DSL, that would be the determining factor. Is it able to provide that kind of high-speed switched broadband telecommunications capability that enables users and then to originate and receive, and that says high-quality video, data, graphics, video telecommunications. So that's where, as time has gone on and the applications have kind of pushed the limits of some of these older technologies like DSL, let's say, that suddenly we became aware that, okay, well, this is not really advanced telecommunications capability anymore. This is not broadband anymore. So what is the speed that would define and I'm just going to call it broadband instead of advanced telecommunications. What is the speed that would define broadband? So the FCC over time has been pushing that speed up, and now they're saying, do we need to, we need to do that again. It's been a while since we looked at it, and they're trying to get comment on that as to, what it should be. So let's take a look here further into this. So although Congress did not define the terms deployment and availability as used in Section 706, and they didn't define it in a sense, in my opinion, they were kind of using it synonymously. They weren't necessarily separating it, but they're saying that they kind of separated those two things. It says Congress stated that the Commission must assess the availability of advanced telecommunications capability, and then it directed that specific findings be made regarding deployment. Section 706 does not equate these two terms, and we therefore believe that in order to give meaning to both terms, we have discretion in assessing availability to consider other factors other than solely the state of deployment. I think they're reaching there. I think they are used synonymously. They just use the two terms differently in that, is it available? And if it's not available, it needs to be deployed. It's not available if it's not deployed. So they're kind of saying, we see it two different ways. So I think they're trying to bring in the other things here, like, is it affordable? In other words, if it's deployed but not affordable, is it really available? Well, it depends. Can you afford it? There could be other things. Is there a competitive, is there more than one competitor? If there's not, then is it really available? Well, yeah, it is. If there's just one person there, it's just maybe you're paying more because there's not two people in there. So I think they're reaching here. If a court got a hold of this, specifically the Supreme Court, they would strike that down, especially in light of the way they've recently ruled on things like major questions, the major questions doctrines. I don't think they would read this the same way the FCC is, but that's beside the point. But anyway, that's what they're saying there. Defining advanced telecommunications capability in this section, we seek comment on the appropriate standards for evaluating the physical deployment of fixed and mobile broadband service, including proposing to increase our benchmark for fixed broadband download speed to 100 megabits per second down and 20 megabits per second up, and the relationship between fixed and mobile broadband services. So let's see, in addition to proposing an increase from the existing broadband speed of 25 by 3 to 100 by 20, we seek comment on adopting a long-term fixed broadband speed goal of 1 gig or 1,000 megabits per second, 1 gig down by 500 megabits per second up. We also seek comment on whether we should adopt upload and download speed benchmarks for mobile service and propose to include an assessment in our final report of the number of fixed and mobile broadband providers to which consumers have access. So they're throwing out there 100 by 20. And again, I think that makes sense because that is what the BEAD program is going to be funding. Anything, that's why I think the BEAD program had two definitions in there. It's got underserved and unserved. So the current broadband speed when the BEAD program came out was 25 by 3. So they said anything under than 25 by 3, we already know if it's 25 by 3 or higher, it's considered broadband, advanced telecommunications service. If it's under 25 by 3, it's unserved. So they don't have access to broadband. But if it's 25 by 3 to 100 by 20, it's not the best broadband. We'll call that underserved. So basically what they're saying is 100 by 20, you've got broadband currently, but you're underserved. So now that what they're saying is when they go to 100 by 20, that's everything under that's going to be unserved. So it's, that's one reason we want to try through the BEAD program and everything else to get as many people as we can, if not everybody, over 100 by 20, because then everybody, once this new standard goes into place, will have broadband and we'll have universal broadband. Now, will that be good forever? As we have new kinds of applications coming out and people are going to need higher than 100 by 20, most people right now don't need higher by, certainly individuals. Most people don't need higher than 100 by 20. It's nice to have if you want to download big movies or upload lots of files. It's nice to have that higher speed, but it's not critical for broadband to have that. So they're saying anything, 100 by 20 will be considered broadband, 100 by 20 or better. And they're also seeking to put out this, what kind of the stretch on what they want to get for the future at 100 by 500. And how do we do that? So that's another reason, by the way, why, people talk about you shouldn't be focusing on fiber. Well, again, goalposts keep moving. And if you put technology in there that can't move with the goalposts, can't move with the needs or the applications that are being used on broadband, then you're going to be in the same situation that we've been in for years when we had DSL. looked like a good technology, and suddenly it was not nearly fast enough. And we discovered that really quickly during COVID. So you want to put fiber wherever you can, but there still needs to be, some options for those areas where fiber is just really expensive and just not feasible. So 100 by 20 seems right. And I like the fact that they're putting in a goal for something better, and they talk about that here. So scroll down past some background stuff. They talk about COVID-19 here and how that impact. What else? Other stuff in here you can read through if you'd like to. Let me get down to where they start asking questions or what they'd like to find out. So here, we seek comment on our proposal to adopt 100 by 20 as the benchmark speed. Do commentators agree that the changes in telehealth, and they talked about that prior to this, why this is needed. The commenters agree that the changes in telehealth, work, and e-learning patterns, the market behavior of consumers and ISPs, and recent policy deployment or developments requiring higher speed services necessitate a speed benchmark of at least 100 by 20 to satisfy the definition of high-speed switch broadband telecom capability, or again, broadband service, that enables users to originate and receive what was in there, high-quality video, data, graphics, etc. The commenters believe a different speed benchmark is appropriate, and if so, why? Should the benchmark be set to an even higher speed? If so, why? Would increasing the benchmark have any effect on broadband competition? For instance, if the benchmark was increased to 100 by 20, would that artificially reduce the appearance of competition by limiting the number of providers or technologies that the Commission reports as providing advanced telecom capability? So if the benchmark is increased to 100 by 20, does that artificially reduce the appearance of competition? So in other words, right now, you might have some deploying, wireless service at 25 by 3 or 50 by 20 or whatever, and you've got cable modem service at, let's say, 200 by 30 or 500 by 30. So as soon as you raise it to 100 by 20, then suddenly you've got one less competitor in there because they're not able to provide broadband service because they're not able to do 100 by 20. So they're just asking about that. And yeah, that would be the case. But I think, in most areas, especially once we get BEAD money deployed, it's going to be 100 by 20 in most everywhere, if not everywhere. Is it necessary for the Commission to examine particular consumer use cases in selecting a speed benchmark? If so, what such use cases demonstrate? What do such use cases demonstrate? We seek comment on the online applications, use cases, and technologies that commenters believe a sufficient number of consumers are using today and will use in the foreseeable future. So I put a note in here, augmented reality, where is it? Augmented reality, augmented and virtual reality. So that's something that a lot of people will bring up as a need for low latency as well as faster upload speeds. So in other words, you could put on glasses and a virtual reality headset and use that via broadband, or augmented reality where you put on glasses and you can see around you, you can see your environment. I can see my desk and everything, but I can, kind of the sci-fi kind of thing where I can, click on and see different things and move them around with my hands, and little files that I'm moving right there, swiping across, all that kind of cool stuff. So that all requires a lot of bandwidth, but how many people are going to be using that? Virtual reality hasn't really kicked in yet. So it's kind of a fringe case, I think, but more and more people will maybe start using that. There's other things that have really driven a lot of upstream traffic, like video cameras, those kinds of things. So these things change and you start to need more bandwidth. So they're trying to get some comments on kinds of applications that people are using today. Again, video cameras, very common today. Other things driving upload speeds and what that all means. Given the increasing importance of upload speed, is there a continuing reason to differentiate download and upload speeds in our benchmark, or should we consider setting a benchmark with symmetrical download and upload speeds? Are the demands of upload broadband uses growing at a rate at which they may soon be the same as download demands? My answer to them, I'm not going to bother commenting, but my answer to them is no. I think it's going to be a really long time before people are going to need the same speed, unless you've got low download speed, before people are going to need the same upload speed as download speed. For example, gig symmetrical. Most people who have gig broadband service don't need a gig up almost ever, right? Again, it's nice if you just took a bunch of, photographs with your digital camera, not your phone, but let's say a good digital SLR camera, and you're trying to upload those to the cloud or something like that. It's nice if that can happen pretty quickly, but you don't do that all the time. So those are the kinds of things where I think that the answer to that would probably be no, and that makes it much more difficult in the short term. Again, you're then suddenly cutting out a lot of things that, a lot of companies that could provide broadband today, but maybe not symmetrical service. So they can provide good download speeds and more than enough upload speed for most people, but maybe they can't get it symmetrical. So that would cut out a lot of people that have broadband, and then suddenly you won't have a lot of people that don't have broadband anymore. So again, you change something, and suddenly the number of people that have broadband changes just with your definitions. That's a bad idea. Rather than adopt a speed benchmark of 100 by 20, as proposed, is there sufficient? Did I just read that? No. As proposed, there's sufficient cause to instead adopt a symmetrical benchmark of 100 by 100. Are the arguments against the adoption of a symmetrical benchmark of 100 by 100 sufficient to outweigh the attendant benefits to users and the country at large of establishing such a speed threshold? For example, would a symmetrical benchmark adversely affect competition by minimizing other technologies or providers that can provide non-symmetrical download speeds, but that might otherwise satisfy consumer demands? And that's what I'm saying is 100 by 20 would satisfy most consumer demands if that's, let's say, fixed wireless. Let's say they can't do 100 by 20, or satellite broadband can't do 100 by 20, and it's somebody on the top of a mountain. But they can get the satellite broadband. In most cases, they're thrilled with that service, with the kinds of things that they're doing today and will probably be doing in the next 5 years. They're thrilled with that service. And they would say they have broadband. They would say they have good service. But there's certain things, certain services or technologies, again, fixed wireless might be hard to get over 100 by 20, or it might be hard to get 100 symmetrical depending on how you're doing that. Whereas that might be the only thing that is viable in that area for now. So again, if you're shooting for 100 by 20, you're going to try to put in fiber if you can. And if there's an area that's reasonable to put in fiber, it's going to get fiber, and 100 by 100 is going to be easy. So there's no reason to set it at 100 by 100 and then to knock out all of those other areas that can't quite do it. Let's keep it at 100 by 20. And then if there's a market case or funding to make it fiber, they'll get there. They'll have no problem getting to 100 by 100. Small business needs. We see comment on what the needs of small businesses should be taken into account, taking into consideration in our determination of a new speed benchmark. And even for small, let's call it a small home office kind of thing, SOHO, most of those, even 100 by 20 would be sufficient. Now, if they're trying to host servers, like a web server, that kind of thing, they would need maybe more upload speed, but they want to know how that should be taken into account. Long-term speed goal. In evaluating broadband deployment, we must not only look at the present, but also the future. We therefore seek comment on adoption of a long-term speed goal for fixed broadband service with a benchmark of 1 gig by 500, a speed adopted for many locations in recently established Commission Universal Service Fund programs. So before I read further here, so if you think about the technology that's out there now, a lot of the folks that are getting broadband today are getting it through cable modem service. And cable modem service provides some really good speeds, and with DOCSIS 3.1 can provide really, more than enough speed than people need today, but it's not able necessarily to get symmetrical service. So a gig by 500 is going to be much easier for a cable operator than trying to do a gig symmetrical. Eventually, they will be replacing their HFC plant with fiber, and they'll be able to do a gig symmetrical with no problem. And even today, if somebody needs a gig symmetrical in some areas, they can go ahead and offer that to some subscribers on a as-needed basis. So, for example, a small business that maybe they want to serve as they extend fiber further out in their network, and as they can go into the fiber node, depending on the type of node they have, they might be able to put in a fiber module and serve one customer fiber, and everybody else gets HFC, and that way they don't have the cost of ripping out their existing plant. So that would be a reason to not do symmetrical gigs. So I like how they're looking at 1 gig by 500 to take into account that, again, not everybody, it doesn't have to be symmetrical. 500 megabits per second upload is upstream or upload is very, very fast. And that's more than enough for most people. So I think that makes sense. It says establishing a long-term goal. Back here where I can scroll. Could not only give notice to policymakers and market participants as to how advanced telecommunications capabilities are likely to be defined in the near future, but also give all parties, government and industry alike, a collective goal toward which to strive. And that makes sense. So the way I could see this happening is that we've got the goal of a gig by 500 out there. And then we get to that point where we say, okay, this is where we are now. We're at 100, or a gig by 500, and that's our new definition. Well, then you set another goal out there. Maybe it's gig symmetrical, or maybe it's 5 gigs by 1 gig, that kind of thing. Or at that point, everybody's probably on fiber, so maybe just doing 5 gig symmetrical or 10 gig symmetrical. So you start looking at your future goals. So that makes sense. It says, we're concerned that our lack of a long-term goal may be sending an inappropriate signal to policymakers. Would an aspirational standard encourage deployment? Should we adopt such a long-term benchmark? How should we define long-term? In other words, how many years? Service quality. We recognize that other factors besides the speed of a broadband connection can affect consumers' ability to use services effectively. Chief among these factors is latency. I know that's a big deal for a lot of people. They say, speed is fine, but latency is really important. And it depends on what they're doing. If they're a gamer, latency is really important. These days, they need speed and latency. High speed, low latency. But it's going to be important as other applications come out that are going to require lower latency. So I know on the DOCSIS side, they've got low latency DOCSIS that is being worked on. Fiber is low latency, pretty much just out of the box. You've got low Earth orbit satellites that are pretty good on latency. You've got geosynchronous satellites that are awful on latency. But for those that really need low latency, how important is that? So they're trying to determine that. Latency can be critical because it affects the consumer's ability to use real-time applications, including voice over internet protocol or VoIP service. And actually, latency is not so much important with VoIP. It's more jitter. It's the change in latency that's important with VoIP that will cause problems. Sometimes that's more important, is how consistent the latency is. If you've got consistent latency and it's not horrible, like I mentioned, geosynchronous satellite, then it can be okay. But in this case, whereas low latency, let's say for a gamer, if you're out there shooting somebody virtually, not for real, you want to make sure that you're as quick as possible. So that for gamers, low latency is important. But for things like VoIP, I think it's more about jitter. Distance learning applications in online gaming, that's the one. Actual as opposed to advertised speed received. Consistency of speed and data allowances are also important. So I know that's a big hot button for folks is, what you have in the broadband data collection process is the ISPs going and saying, our maximum advertised speed is X. And maybe it's not really being delivered. So a lot of people say, hey, they're saying they're providing this and it's not. That's not reasonable. Where that really becomes an issue is when you're on that cusp of what broadband is, what's unserved or underserved. So if somebody's saying, yeah, we're providing 25 by 3, well, if you're really not, then that is really a factor as to whether somebody's getting broadband or not these days. Are they served or not? Are they unserved or served? Or, yeah, we're providing 100 by 20. Well, that's saying they're either underserved or they're served. So do you see what I'm saying? So in that sense, those are the ones where it's really important that they be reporting the exact speed that people are able to get. And that's a hot button topic for folks. If it's a provider out there, it's a cable operator, and they're providing, 500 by, let's say a half a gig by 100 meg down, then they're well over that. And if they're really 400 by 75, is it that important? Now, most cable operators actually underreport, or actually their maximum speed that they advertise is generally lower than what they actually are offering. So they try to put a little cushion on top of that so that when somebody runs a speed test, they go, oh, I'm actually getting that, or I'm getting a little bit higher. So, if somebody's over that, sometimes they don't mind putting that cushion in there. So it's really important where they're on that cusp of what the broadband definition is. Given these considerations regarding service quality, we seek comment on whether and to what extent we should consider these factors. Should we establish concrete benchmarks? Broadband networks funded by the BEAD program must provide latency that is sufficiently low to allow reasonably foreseeable real-time interactive applications. Should we adopt the same or similar standard by which to judge latency or quality of service generally? So again, today, they just have a speed for broadband. Should they have a latency requirement in there? The latency requirement for BEAD is actually not very low. whether or not you can do a round trip in 100 milliseconds or less is, I think, the latency requirement there. And that's a simple yes or no. And most services can do that. Again, not geosynchronous satellite, but I think even low Earth orbit satellite, LEO satellites can do the latency requirement under BEAD. Mobile broadband service. So they're talking about speed for mobile broadband. The Commission has not adopted a mobile advanced telecommunications capability benchmark in previous reports, primarily due to the inherent variability in the performance characteristics of mobile service, both geographically and temporally. The Commission is now collecting both mobile and fixed broadband availability data through BDC, the broadband data collection process, and has already collected 3 rounds of data. So they've been through these 3 rounds of collecting both for fixed broadband and mobile broadband information like speeds and latency and where service is available. The BDC standardizes several of the mobile propagation map parameters that were not standardized in the FCC Form 477 data collection, such as minimum speeds for each technology, 3G, 4G, LTE, and 5G NR, and parameter values for cell edge probability, cell loading, and spatial resolution. We see comment for purpose on the next report on whether we should continue to use the multiple speed metrics approach and whether we should also rely on UCLA data in addition to BDC data. If we also use on-the-ground speed test data as part of a multiple speed metrics approach, what on-the-ground speed metrics should we use for 5G and R? Should we continue to present 4G LTE availability data also? So they're asking for comments on that. Should we adopt a speed benchmark to assess whether mobile services provide advanced telecommunications capability? And if so, what should that benchmark be? So that is a question. Is mobile going to be sufficient to say that somebody has broadband service if that's all that they have? They expand on those questions. Service quality. In addition to upload and download speeds, other characteristics of mobile service quality include latency, jitter, and packet loss, especially while in motion. It may be correspondingly appropriate to analyze these metrics from report to report. As mobile networks transition to higher performance standards, such as those required by 5G NR, and 5G NR, I forget what the NR stands for, but basically it's a true 5G network. I think kind of from start to finish, as opposed to just portions of it. Should the Commission analyze additional criteria for the Section 706 report going forward? And if so, should it consider benchmarks for these criteria that would affect a mobile network's performance? For example, if data shows certain levels of high latency, would that be evidence that a provider's network is not providing advanced telecommunications capability? We see comment generally regarding how to address additional potential criteria for the purposes of these reports and what data sources the Commission could rely on for analysis of additional metrics from year to year. Number of providers. As part of the next report, we propose to include an assessment of the number of fixed and mobile broadband provider options to which consumers have access. Such data may help us understand barriers to deployment because of the number of providers may correlate, at least to some degree, with such barriers. Further, where there are provider options for broadband service, there may also tend to be more competitive pricing and better quality of services or service. We see comment on this proposal. So they're saying, we want to start collecting data on how many providers there are, so it will help, for example, I was talking about pole attachments, those kinds of things. So if you've got an area where there's just one provider, it maybe gives you an indication that there are some barriers there that others can't get in to that area. Now, it could be the barriers are just the cost to deploy, period. Again, farmlands, areas where it's very remote, it's just going to be hard to have more than one provider and actually support that provider with revenue, because you have fewer customers, you've got more miles, and if you've got 2 competitors there, they're trying to split that limited number of customers. It makes it more difficult. But there could be reasons, like I say, some other barriers that are making it difficult, maybe some anti-competitive things. And then also they're saying, if there's more than one competitor, then that brings prices down. That's true. Relationship between fixed and mobile broadband service. In considering the extent of substitutability, that's hard to say, substitutability between fixed and mobile services, the Commission has recognized that consumers have distinct broadband uses in the home and on the go. Yeah. For instance, a fixed service is typically needed to connect all of the smart devices in the home with sufficient bandwidth to enable all those devices use at the same time. In contrast, consumers may also access the internet on a mobile device in their homes. A mobile a mobile service is necessary for internet access when consumers are on the go. These services are often marketed as complementary, and the Commission has previously cited evidence that consumers who have the means to subscribe to both mobile and fixed services are likely to subscribe to both. This suggests that mobile and fixed broadband services may not be substitutes for all consumers' needs. Many households continue to subscribe to both fixed and mobile broadband service, suggesting that these separate services offer benefits that households may view as complementary or independent of each other. We seek comment for the purposes of the next report on whether to continue not treating fixed and mobile services as full substitutes. And I think we saw during the COVID pandemic, we saw people that had a lot of people had no fixed broadband service at home, and they didn't really feel like they needed it. At home, they had their phone and they could do things on the internet. They could search for stuff. They could even stream off of their phone certain things, depending on the data plan they had. And they felt like they didn't necessarily need to pay for fixed broadband service. And if they needed to do something, they could a lot of times do it at work. If they're in the office, they could do some things where they required more bandwidth. Hopefully not watching HD movies at work or whatever, but they could do things at work, they could do things at home on their phone, and then suddenly the pandemic hits and they were having to do work at home and they were having to do school at home, and it was not enough. So we saw that, but I think a lot of people after the pandemic may have dropped their fixed connections. A number of them probably dropped their fixed connections and went back to just being mobile at home. So in some cases, people don't want to pay for that second one. It could have to do with affordability, or it could have to do with the fact that they just don't feel like they need it and they can save that money. But that's a good question to look at. Was there anything else in here? I think there was. Let me scroll down. Here we go. Affordability. So it's more apparent than ever before that broadband is a necessity for all Americans, yet far too many households across the country wrestle with how to pay for gas and groceries and also keep up with the broadband bill. I might add, that's really become difficult the last couple of years because of the inflation, which has hit food, especially, for example. And, you can't buy a home. And for a while, their rents got crazy. So I know that that's been difficult for people, both the housing and food and gas. Obviously, gas has gone up a lot in the last couple of years. So this has made the affordability issue more front and center for broadband, because a lot of people will see, do I eat or do I have my broadband connection? What are they using the broadband connection for? Those kinds of things. So the lack of access to and adoption of home broadband has amplified and reinforced existing inequities in our society. To truly close the connectivity gap and ensure that all Americans have access to advanced telecommunications capability, i.e. broadband services must be affordable. And that's that. Access to anything. Somebody who needs access to something, food, shelter, telephone service, cable TV, broadband, it's got to be affordable. And, people have to make choices as to what they're going to spend their money on, depending on how much they make. But broadband has become more and more important for people, especially if they don't have a job and they need to find one. It's helpful for that. So these are things that need to be taken into account. And of course, we've got, I think it mentions it here, the Affordable Connectivity Program. But, something like that program, very expensive, going to run out of money probably spring or so of next year. And to maintain it, billions of dollars per year for the number of people that we have on there. So there are questions about that and how sustainable that is. So as we seek comment on how we should measure affordability as part of our Section 706 inquiry, can low adoption rates for particular services indicate that the service is perceived as not affordable, rather than merely demonstrating the revealed preferences of consumers given their overall service requirements and budget constraints? Are they not getting it because they're just not into it? Or, again, they can do what they need to do at work and their phone is fine at home, those kinds of things. What other factors may lead to differential subscription rates for higher speed services between higher income and lower income areas? We also seek comment on the extent to which the answers to these questions depend on the technology deployed, such as mobile, fixed terrestrial, fixed wireless, or fixed satellite. So something like satellites can be $100 a month, but usually when you get that when there's no other option. So, it's like that, or DSL that's slow, or nothing maybe. The other question is, they talk about economic, but a lot of times whether somebody has access to broadband or whether it's affordable has to do with where it is. And it could be an urban area It could be a low income area, but it could also be a very rural area where the incomes are not that high, and it's expensive because it's expensive to deliver. So there's lots of variables in there. It's much more expensive to provide broadband service in very rural areas because of the fact that you've got these long runs, you've got fewer customers. When you've got to roll a truck, it's a lot further. It takes more hours to get somewhere. Add it all up on the truck rolls, it's less time, more people, and more time that you're spending out on the road just to service one customer, for example. Or I should say a few customers. Adoption. We propose to examine the universal service goal of adoption by examining the rate at which people who have service available to them actually subscribe to the service. We seek comment on this proposal and whether there are alternative ways to conceive of adoption. Adoption rates can be heavily influenced by, among other things, how affordable the service is. Yeah. If it's not that affordable, it depends on your age. A lot of older folks, older than me probably, are, again, they're not that into it. They don't do that much on their broadband. They still got their traditional TV service, and they're not really streaming stuff. And they get on there, they check their email, they check pictures of the grandkids, those kinds of things. So there's that demographic. There's those that are sometimes younger that, again, they're more mobile. And it's like, I'm fine on my mobile device. I don't really need a connection in the house. So there's different things in addition that would cause people not to adopt the service other than affordability. In some cases with young folks, it's too expensive and they don't necessarily need it because they don't, they haven't, their income is not what it is, what it's going to be a few years later, let's say. We collect fixed subscriber information as part of the FCC Form 477 data collection, which can be used in conjunction with deployment data to estimate the adoption rates for the census tract and less granular areas such as the county and the state. Should we use FCC Form 477 data to measure adoption rates for fixed broadband service? Are there any weaknesses to these data? If so, what are they? Should we present fixed broadband adoption data only generally or also on technology-specific basis, such as separate data for fixed terrestrial, fixed wireless, and fixed satellite? Yeah, I might as well do them all. And again, you're going to see fixed satellite adoption. You're going to see that adopted in areas that don't have other choices. Satellite's available everywhere. But people in the city are not going to get satellite service. People in a suburb where they have two or more fixed broadband providers, fixed wired providers, and maybe a couple of fixed wireless providers, maybe T-Mobile's there providing fixed wireless service, they're not going to get satellite service. So that's going to dictate that. And there's going to be more fixed wireless adoption in areas that don't have fiber or cable modem service. So yeah, that's all going to impact that. Should we use Form 477 data to also measure mobile broadband subscribership, that is handset count data? So that's a question there. Are there potential sources of data other than Form 477 subscribership data that can be used to measure adoption? Talks there about other kinds of things like Broadband Now, Pew Research Center, other kinds of sources of that data. Availability. When discussing the universal service goal of availability of service, we refer to consumers' ability to purchase broadband service in areas where service is physically deployed. For instance, broadband service may be physically deployed to a location, but the wiring of a building does not support all of its tenants. So, usually you've got all or none. So you could have broadband service going past a building, and folks in there, maybe they're getting DSL over the phone lines, but they don't have, fiber's not running the building or cable's not running the building. They don't have cable modem service, that kind of thing. It's usually if it's available to one unit, it's available to all, but it's the same service. So there are things that you can do there. And I've talked in the past about GHN service, which is gigabit home network, they call it, but it's a way to run gigabit service over existing wires in a MDU, for example. So you can run your fiber to the building, and then you've got a little multiplexer that you put outside the building or in the building in a closet, and then you can run gigabit broadband over phone lines or over coax. If that building's already wired, you don't need to rewire it. So there are definitely solutions there, but in general, you're either going to rewire the whole building and everybody's going to have it, or you're going to use G.HN and you can offer it unit by unit as they subscribe. And by the way, check us out if you're interested in G.HN. We can provide a solution for that. We'll get you connected up or hooked up with that. So check us out, zquorum.com. So are there other elements of service availability that we should consider? For instance, should this goal be understood to encompass the quality of broadband service, including, for example, the frequency of service outages? If so, what criteria should the Commission rely upon to define availability for the purpose of this inquiry? Is there quantitative or qualitative data that the Commission can rely on to analyze service availability for this purpose? So you may have a fixed broadband to your home and it's down all the time. Now, what is all the time? Does it go down? How many minutes per month is it out? Or is it out like several times a day, or are there periods where you've got 2 days where it's out, where they're having problems? Maybe they're getting a DDoS attack, or they've got a fiber cut and something's out. How often is that happening? And is broadband available if that's happening? Well, I would say if it's, you've got to allow every operator is going to have an issue every now and then. Like I say, every operator could get a DDoS attack, or they could have a fiber cut that's going to impact customers for some period of time. And I don't think you could say that broadband's not available if that happens, if there's a period of time. But if the service is really unreliable, you're trying to use it and several times a day, it's just not fast enough to do anything. Well, then that, in my opinion, maybe you don't have broadband available, and that would be just a service provider issue. So they're asking, do you want to measure that? Now, something else is how much of it is out of the customer's network. So quite often, when customers are experiencing broadband issues, it's not the broadband provider, it's their home network. They've got a wireless router, and they're somewhere off in the basement trying to do stuff, and it's on the third floor, and the wireless router's or they're out on the deck trying to do something, or they've got their wireless router behind the fishbowl, behind a fish tank, or in a closet. So they're doing things that are making it really hard for their home network to work properly. So quite often, we provide help desk services for broadband providers around the country, and quite often, most of the time, when somebody calls in and they say, hey, my internet connection's bad, we look into that, and it's like, oh, you got to, looks like your connection is good. You need to look at your wireless network, and then we try to help them with their in-home Wi-Fi to figure out where they're having a problem. So those are some things to take into account. Equitable access. Available data suggests that minority groups often do not have the same access to broadband. And, frankly, again, rural areas, could be minorities in rural areas, but just rural areas in general is where a lot of the problem is. It's those hard to reach areas. It's not so much whether somebody's a minority or not, it's where the area is, where it's a problem. Now, affordability is an issue sometimes in low income areas. And then you've got, and that low income area could be a rural area as well. So it's not so much, I think it's more about where and how hard it is to serve an area quite often. For example, we note that according to at least one Pew Research Center survey, while 80% of white adults reported having home broadband access, only 71% of black adults and 65% of Hispanic adults had such access. And I would question there whether they have access available, or whether they, in other words, is it that it's not affordable and they don't have access? Or is it that there's not broadband there? So I'm not sure what that means. In addition, the subscription figures for the Affordable Connectivity Program indicate that 54.2% of the program subscribers chose to use their monthly benefit for mobile broadband, compared to less than 45.8% that use their subsidy for fixed services. So that kind of goes back to that idea that I was saying, where sometimes people are perfectly happy with their with just having mobile broadband. That's what they want it for. They got it in their hand. They're doing stuff all day long. They want it on their phone. They're not necessarily going to a computer, to do anything. Maybe they're not streaming lots of stuff on TV. I don't know, but a lot of people they would apply it there. They have the option to do the fixed broadband, but they're doing the mobile. Maybe they find that more important to use it for that. What can we infer from these statistics? Can we identify a lack of equitable access from the revealed preferences of consumers given their overall service requirements and budget constraints? Moreover, the lack of broadband availability on tribal lands appears to be particularly acute. Are there steps that the next report can and should take to address diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility? What additional steps can the Commission take to promote equitable access to broadband? And obviously, the BEAD program, Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment, is focusing a lot on that. There's the digital equity kinds of stuff that's in there. So a lot of that's being looked at. You've got the Affordable Connectivity Program that it mentioned, 20 plus million people on that program. I think that's the end of this. Yeah, pretty much. So with the ACP, again, you've got, I think 22 million now on that. And the the bar for that ACP is pretty low, really, because if you look at it, 4 out of 10 households could qualify for the ACP. So the question is that the right number? Or if, by having that number, are we saying that people who really need it aren't going to be able to get it because we're trying to fund 4 out of every 10 households, or maybe it should be 2 out of every 10 households, depending on income levels, those kinds of things. So that needs to be looked at as well, because again, that's really hard to sustain, especially given as we don't have the money. We just don't. The U.S. we spend regularly more than we take in, and that's not sustainable. And it's gotten really bad in the last few years, where we're spending way more than we take in, and eventually chickens are going to come home to roost on that. So hopefully we can get some of that straightened out. So we need to look at those things as far as affordability, but also how do we fund something like the ACP? I've stated that I really think it needs to be those people that can afford broadband, maybe a charge kind of like the USF, a charge on the bill that helps fund it for other people that can't. But it needs to be such that that you're not that a person who can afford broadband is not paying for a whole nother broadband subscription, or even again 4 out of 10. It needs to be for those that really need that kind of a benefit, is the way I would see that going. And that way, it's not a tax burden on everybody. Doesn't cause our deficit to go up. Doesn't cause we don't have to fund that through the budget and through taxes on everybody. So, all right. So there you go. Again, I linked to this and I linked to that Telecom Act if you want to look at that over the weekend and read through that. It's been around since 1996. You may have started that sometime back then, and now you can finish it this weekend. I linked to that. So thanks for joining me today. Hopefully this provided some background and what the FCC is trying to do there. And again, these comments are open to everybody. I didn't look and see where. I'm probably not going to comment. But if you want to comment, I'm sure somewhere in the document that I posted to there is information on where and how you can comment on this. So you can check that out. Thanks for joining me today. Again, I mentioned, you see our web address there and our phone number and email address. So if there's anything we can help you with, let us know. I mentioned G.HN. We can help with that. I mentioned we can do help desk services for broadband operators. There's a lot more we can do if you're a broadband provider. So check us out there. You see our web address, our phone number, and our email address. If this was interesting, if you give me a like on the video, I'd appreciate it. Not subscribed yet, click the subscribe button, click the bell, and you'll be notified when I'm live. See you next time. Bye-bye.